All right, guys, today we're going to make a pumpkin patch, and our pumpkin patch is going to show perspective. What perspective is the way that something looks from the viewer, and it shows distance or space, all right? So ours is going to show perspective. So the way it's going to work is we're going to have some pumpkins that are in the foreground, some pumpkins that are in the middle ground, and some pumpkins that are in the background. And we'll talk a little bit more about that as we go on. Let's see what we're going to use today for our supplies. So we're going to need a pencil. We are going to need a Sharpie marker. We are going to need a paintbrush, paint. I'm going to use watercolor paint, so I have water as well, and some crayons. All right, so let's get started with our pumpkin patch perspective picture. Try to say that 3 times fast. Pumpkin patch perspective picture. All right, so here we go. To start, you are going to draw 4 pumpkins in the foreground. So the foreground of your picture is the bottom of your picture. Things in the foreground are closest to the viewer, and they're usually the biggest things in the picture, and they have the most details. So you're going to draw 4 pumpkins. My 4th one kind of went off the edge a little bit. That's totally fine. It's all right if you have 5. It's all right if you have 3. We're just shooting for 4. After that, we're going to go to our next row of pumpkins. Since this is a pumpkin patch, we're imagining it's a long field. So our next row is going to go in between those ones. So you're going to add some half circles in between that first row in the foreground. And they're getting a little bit smaller, so you're just going to keep filling those in. We'll just finish filling in that row. All right, so we've got that row of pumpkins. They're a little bit smaller than the first row, but not that much smaller yet. And already you could start to see it's starting to look a little bit like it's got some depth to it. You're starting to see that perspective grow. So you can tell these ones are closer and these ones are just a little bit further. So now we're going to go and do our next row. And these ones are starting to get significantly smaller. So now you can really tell that those ones are definitely smaller than that first row, definitely smaller than that second row. And again, I'm just filling them in between them first. So I'm going in between the last row and adding them. And then I'm just going to fill in the ones in between those that I need to. So now we really can see the depth grow. Like this is really starting to look like it's got some space to it, and it's really starting to look a little 3-dimensional. We're going to add actually a little bit more. So you can actually go back and even add a couple more little ones. And this is really going to make it look like it's a really long field, totally full of pumpkins. Don't go crazy. You don't want to be drawing teeny tiny ones that are, you're never going to be able to trace at the end, because eventually we are going to trace these. So you don't want them to get too small to where you're not able to do that. And there, that's good. That's my final row. Now what happened is because I made that actually created my horizon line. And you guys remember the horizon line is the place where the sky and the ground meet. So now we don't even have to draw a horizon line because those pumpkins have created our horizon line. The last thing I'm going to do on these pumpkins is I'm actually going to go in and add some details. So my ones in the foreground are going to have details in them. I'm going to add some stems. So I draw a stem, and I just erase that part inside, so that way it looks like it's in front. Remember we talked about overlapping. That is going to show the overlapping. So you draw the stems however you want. If you could try to draw them the same way I am, or you could do yours a little bit different. But we're just going to go in and add the stems for our first row of pumpkins. I think in our second row we might actually add a couple stems too, because they're still pretty close. And like we said, things that are in the foreground. The foreground is going to have the most details. That's where you're going to see stuff that has details because it's close to you. It's what you're able to see. These pumpkins that are really small, that are far away, they're so far back that you're not going to be able to see the details on them. They still have details, but they're just so far away that you can't see it. So I'm just going to add my stems to that next row. Again, I'm erasing in between each one. All right, now that we have the stems on our first row or 2 of pumpkins, we're actually going to add the lines as well. So the lines are what's going to make our pumpkins look round. So watch how we're going to add the lines. What I like to do is imagine there's an imaginary line down the middle. So I'm not actually going to draw it, but imagine there's a line down the middle. All of the lines that are on this side of that line are going to curve just like this outside line. See this outside line right here? these lines are going to curve just like that until you get to the center. And then the lines on the other side are going to curve like that outside line. And that's what's going to start to make your pumpkin look round. So go ahead, add your lines curving on each side. Again, since this row is kind of in between, you could add some lines to these. You don't have to do it. If you have a lot of details and you don't think you want to add them to the next row, you don't have to, because they're starting to get a little further. So you might not see the lines in them. The ones behind that in the middle ground or the background of our pumpkin patch, you don't have to worry about adding any details to those ones. All right, so now we've got our pumpkin patch. Before we trace, we just want to think about if we want to add any other details. So I'm thinking mine, because it's a pumpkin patch, sometimes if you ever go to a pumpkin patch, you might see there's a spooky tree or something in the background. So I'm going to actually draw a spooky tree kind of off in the distance. And remember, talking about foreground, middle ground, and background, things that are in the background are the smallest things. So they're smaller, they're further away. So that, even though it's a tree, it's not very big. I didn't make a very big tree, because it wouldn't appear that big in perspective. It would look further away, even though this might be a huge tree. Because it's in the way back of our pumpkin patch, it looks kind of small. If you look at the branches, I'm just drawing a bunch of little Ys. It's kind of an easy way to draw spooky branches. Now what you're going to do is take your Sharpie marker and you're going to trace over all of that pencil that you made already. So take a couple minutes and you're just going to trace over everything with Sharpie marker. All right, so now we've finished tracing over everything. Now the last step we're going to do before we get ready to paint is we're going to use our crayons. And what we're going to use our crayons for is to go in and color our pumpkins, or we can even color parts of our pumpkins. It's up to you. If you want to color your pumpkins in with crayons, awesome, do it. I'm going to color in just my stems with crayons, and then I'm going to paint the rest. And then I'm actually going to color in my tree with crayons, and I'm going to add a couple things because this is a Halloween picture. I'm going to add a couple like fall-looking leaves on the tree, like there's still a couple leaves left. And I'm going to use autumn colors like orange and yellow and red. And I'm actually even going to add a moon up in the sky. Now the moon, you're going to have to use a white crayon. So you're going to need a white crayon to do that. And you're going to use your white crayon to draw the moon into your picture. Now you're not really going to be able to see it. So you have to really pay attention to what you're doing and really look for where you're drawing that moon. Because if you stop paying attention, you might miss the spot where you're actually coloring it, because we're drawing white on white. So you got to really pay attention, color inside that circle for your moon. And because we're going to use watercolor paint, when we go to color over this with paint, this moon is going to pop out because wax, which is what crayons are made out of, is water resistant, which means it won't let this watercolor paint get in this area. So it'll still appear as if it's white. I'm actually going to add a couple little craters on it too to make it look kind of like a real moon. Again, this is something you do if you want to. You don't have to. But I think it looks kind of cool. So I'm just going to add a couple of my details with my crayons right now. So go ahead and add your details. Right now I'm ready to paint. So I'm going to use my watercolor paint. And remember, when we're using watercolor paint, the more water that is on your brush, the lighter the color is going to be. The less water that's on your brush, the darker the color will be. So if you want your pumpkins to appear darker, if the color orange is too light, you need to take a little bit of the water off your brush, and that'll help you create that darker color. I also want to show you guys a cool trick too, so watch this. If I'm painting with watercolor paint, and if I make a mistake, let's say I get that color there and I don't want it. Here's a cool thing you could do with your paintbrush. If you take your brush and your water cup and you squeeze out the water out of your brush to make it totally dry, you can actually use that brush almost like a mop. And see how it pulled up a lot of that paint? It didn't make it perfect, but it can help fix a little mistake. So you just got to be careful when you're using the watercolor paint. If you color, if you're coloring one part of the picture with one color and another part in another color, and they're both wet, they could blend together. And that could create something that maybe you don't want to happen. So I'm just kind of showing you that trick just so you know it. So now you're going to go ahead and color your pumpkins. It's up to you how you color them. You can color them all the same color orange, or if you want to make them appear a little bit different, like most pumpkins are in a pumpkin patch, they're not all the same. You could do it a little bit different. You can make some darker, some lighter. You could even go in with your with some yellow, and maybe add some yellow to some to make them look a little bit lighter. But it's up to you how you do it. So let me try. I'm actually going to try that with a little yellow. Let's see if that works. Yeah, see how if I add a little yellow, it kind of changes the appearance of that pumpkin. I think that kind of makes it look really cool. So I maybe try that. You know, make some dark, some light. But again, you guys are the artists. You're going to make it the way you want. So go ahead and start painting your pumpkins. All right, now that we have our pumpkins painted, we're ready to paint the sky. Since it's a Halloween picture, I want mine to have kind of a spooky colored sky. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to use some black, some blue, and some purple even to make it look a little bit more Halloween looking. The other thing is I'm going to use my brush in a very intentional way. I'm going to use my brush using horizontal side-to-side brush strokes. I'm not going to go up and down. The reason I'm going to go side to side is the streaks that my paint is going to create is actually going to look kind of like clouds in the sky. It'll kind of give that layered look of a sky, of like a spooky night sky. The one thing I want you guys to be careful of when we do this is be careful if your pumpkins are still wet, if you had just painted your pumpkins orange, all along that horizon line we created, there's a chance those colors could blend together. So I would try to let them dry first before you get too close to them with your sky color. So I'm going to work my way from the top down. And when I get here, I'm going to be really careful. Again, if you get the colors to mix together, you could always do that trick that I showed you where you squeeze your brush over the water cup and then mop it up. So go ahead, let's start painting our night sky. There it is, guys. There's our finished pumpkin patch perspective picture. Now, be sure we don't try to move this yet because it's probably pretty wet, especially the sky. And go ahead, let's get started. Take your time. I can't wait to see what you guys make.